Good evening, everyone. My name is Mazes, okay? Today, we are going to be looking at um, a series of documentation and a lot of information that was published this morning by a diehard investigative journalist that we have in Nigeria. My guest today is an award winning journalist, a writer, a researcher with background in marketing and business consulting. He describes himself as a writer, travel addict, and a journalist majoring in politics, tech, and finance. This morning, many of you woke up to see that the internet, or rather the Twitter street, was agog. What was the topic again? Many people, questioned. What has David done this time around? It turns out that the topic today is one of those that many Nigerians they hear about, they talk about them, but no one cares to really look deep and understand what is behind the veil. David wrote about Bola Ahmed Tinubu, from drug lord to presidential candidate. Again, some will say that this is politics, and the other will say, well, politics or not, let us have the facts. I have the privilege of having to speak one on one with the author of this article this evening. Here with me is David Hundeyin. David, you're welcome to Njenje Media TV.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, David. Now, I understand that in one of your Twitter spaces that you basically attended, you alluded to the fact that the Buhari government had affected you so much to the to the point that you had to leave the country and you lost some of the things that you've built in Nigeria up to the moment you left. And to crown it all, that the endsars dealt with you. Would you mind recapping, if you don't mind, what endsars actually did to you and how you got entangled in that web?
Well, I'm not a fan of putting myself at the center of what was clearly like a decentralized youth movement, right? So it wasn't about me, but it just so happened that after the protest itself ended, of course, we know the incident that ended the protest, the massacre at the Lekki Toll Plaza. I was given access to certain documents which essentially implicated the government with regard to knowledge of who was responsible for what happened, because these documents essentially stated that the internet outage that people in parts of Lekki, Ikoyi, and Victoria Island experienced at exactly the time the Lekki massacre was taking place, that the mobile network operators had nothing to do with it, that their fiber optic cables were literally sabotaged at that exact moment. So people actually dug up their fiber optic cables and sabotaged them at exactly 7:10 p.m. on that night, which was exactly the time when the massacre began. So clearly that implicated the state and federal government, because they are the only people who even had access to such things. Because bear in mind that there was a statewide curfew that had been declared. So clearly it was only a government entity that would have been out at that time and that even knew where to even find this infrastructure and disrupt it. And by implicating the government in disrupting that infrastructure at that specific time, by extension, that's also implicating the government in having foreknowledge of the massacre, which would essentially be circumstantial evidence that the massacre was a premeditated thing. And I knew that if I published this story while I'm in the country, they're going to pull me in. They're going to want to know who my source is. It's not going to end well. So I made the decision in November 2020 to get up and leave, basically to leave the country. And I had to leave in the quote unquote Nadeko route fashion, because I was informed that I was on a no-fly list. If you recall, there was a no-fly list at the time where people who, whether rightly or wrongly, were perceived as protest leaders had been put on, so they couldn't. If you try to fly outside the country, your passport will be seized from you at the airport. So I couldn't take that route, so I used the so-called Nadeco route. I found my way out of the country before I eventually found my way into exile, where I eventually was forced to seek asylum. Initially, maybe I didn't even necessarily understand that I was leaving permanently. Maybe I just thought, I don't know what I thought. But again, bear in mind, I was 30 at the time. So at 30, you have a whole life here. Everything is settled here. Yeah, I mean, in your country back home, country that you grew up in, and then all of a sudden, you just sort of at really short notice, you just sort of get up and leave. You're not probably not thinking, right, I'm never coming back. That's not what occurs to you. So that wasn't what occurred to me at the time. But over the next few months, it increasingly started to dawn on me that this is what was happening, and that whether I accepted it or not, whether I realized it or not, from when I left Nigeria in November 2020, life was never going to be the same again. I wasn't going to have the life as I knew it ever again. So, which meant that, for example, the family members that I haven't seen physically since 2020. It's been almost 2 years now. There are family events that I can't go to. My aunt passed on recently. I couldn't be at a funeral. Um, there are there are relationships that I had, friendships that I've suffered because I can't be there anymore. There are business ideas and business relationships that couldn't work out anymore because I can't be there physically to push these things anymore. Everything just sort of changed, basically, and not always for the better. I guess I was a bit lucky because by virtue of the kind of work that I do, all I need really is a place to lay my head, a laptop, and an internet connection, and I'll be fine. I can always work and I can always pay my bills. I don't have such problems. So I guess I'm fine in that sense.
Okay.
But some of the people who fled Nigeria around the same time I did weren't that lucky. And I got to witness some of these difficulties. Some of us who fled Nigeria around the same time had things really, really tough. Some people had to apply for hardship allowances from various NGOs and CSO, but thankfully I never had to do any of that. But basically, life as I knew it in 2020 and life as I know it now are two completely different animals that have very little in common.
Hmm. Well, that's pretty hard to hear and to sit down and you recap this. But before that incident of 2020, obviously, how was you were working in Nigeria, young man, having one of the best. Gradually, I think as of that time, Buhari had been in office for about 5 years. you know, before
Yes.
that Lekki massacre, which they don't want to call Lekki massacre, but again, that is a case of their nomenclature. But before that time, how had what was your perception about the Buhari government, holistically?
So I think this has been very well documented. Going back well before 2015, by the way, from day one, I never understood why it was ever socially acceptable to think of Buhari as a valid electoral choice. I never understood it. Right, Buhari is and remains to date the only Nigerian with the very unfortunate and unwanted distinction of disrupting the only Nigerian alive with the unfortunate distinction of having disrupted a democratically elected civilian government with a military coup. That has only happened twice in Nigeria's history. First in 1966, and the second time in 1983 when he conducted his coup. So from that alone, like that, and then when you consider that this was someone who was directly involved in plotting and executing three separate military coups. He was involved in three different military coups. So the coup of 1966, the coup of the so-called the Murtala Mohammed coup, and
Mhm.
then the coup of 1983 that brought him into power, where he deposed Shehu Shagari. And where when Shehu Shagari was deposed, he locked him up in under house arrest, and then locked his deputy, the vice president, Alex Ekoime, at Kirikiri prison or Atikoyi prison. That was just absolutely wild to me. This guy's level of ethnocentrism, this guy's level of tribalism is off the charts. So that was even before he got elected. So when he came into office, I guess I wasn't really surprised. I was dismayed because I was very, very directly affected. One of the ways in which I was affected was that at the time I was working in marketing. I hadn't moved into journalism full time yet. And I remember when I left my job as the head of content at a creative agency in 2016, and I wanted to set up my own copywriting agency. It just like completely failed to get off the ground at the first attempt, and the reason that happened was because even though I had the portfolio, I had the skills, I had the talent, I had the contacts, I had everything that was needed to create a successful operation. It was in the middle of a recession, and in a recession the first thing that goes is marketing spend. Everybody cuts their marketing budget in a recession, so there was just no money for me. So from like having like a what was pretty much a comfortable job in 2016, May 2016, by August 2016, I found myself driving an Uber, which is what I did for 3 months until I got back into paid employment, full-time paid employment in January 2017. And then from there, then I found my way to Channels TV. That was when I was working at the other news as a writer, and then that's how I sort of found my way back into journalism from marketing. So in a way, the entire reason that I'm a journalist today is because my career path was directly um, influenced twice by Buhari policy decisions. So I just mentioned one, which was the fact that the recession in 2016, which he engineered, affected my career path. If you recall, when he came into office in 2015, one of the first things that he did was that, first of all, he refused to sign the budget for the year ahead. He just refused to sign it. And then he also refused to appoint a cabinet for more than six
Yes, yes,
months.
yes.
And if you're familiar with how the Nigerian economy works, Nigerian government is by far the largest source of liquidity into the Nigerian economy. So
Mhm.
if the budget is not signed, if there's a government shutdown, which is pretty much what happened in early 2016, then the economy goes into recession. That's literally what happened. Nigeria went into recession when they had no business going into recession. There was no reduction in business activity. There was no reason for there to be a recession. He just engineered it out of nothing. And then even before then, if you recall, in 2015, when he came in, one of the very first things he did was he made himself the Minister of Petroleum, and then everything in the entire oil and gas space in Nigeria was frozen. You couldn't do anything. Contracts that had been signed got revoked. Deals that were in progress got frozen. Everything just got ground to a halt because he came in and he said, right, my priority, bear in mind he hadn't appointed ministers or anything. His first priority was this oil and gas space, right? It is my people's turn to eat. That was his whole entire ethos, right? So anybody that could be got rid of, get rid of them, replace them with a Mahmoud, with an Abubakar, with a Mohammed. That was his entire thing when he came in. So this affected me directly because at the time there was a helicopter servicing company. It was called Atlantic Aviation, which was trying to break into the helicopter servicing space alongside
Mhm.
Bristol and Caverton. And I was one of 12 people who had made it through an extremely difficult selection process that had basically taken 6,000 down to 12, right? To become a
Wow.
cadet pilot. So I had even passed my NCAA medical. I had been measured for my pilot's uniform. I was told to submit my passport. We were supposed to get sent to Bristol Academy in Titusville, Florida. And then as soon as he came in, he just totally just nixed everything. And next thing we knew, the program was basically cancelled because the contracts that they sort of had agreed in principle, I think they had one with Chevron, they were negotiating with everything just got frozen. So there was just no cash flow, nothing. So the program was cancelled. The company eventually, ran out of runway and went out of business. And so essentially, like I wouldn't even have even gone into marketing if this guy hadn't intervened. I would have been a helicopter pilot by now. I'd be somewhere landing a AW139 over Escravos or somewhere.
So
So
maybe
this
maybe you
guy,
you might be flying him to Castina helipad.
well, so yeah, two separate occasions in the space of a year, this guy directly altered my career path. So obviously, I was directly affected by it. And then, in a general sense, the insecurity problem which existed before him was magnified by a magnitude of about 10 when he came in. Because in addition to Boko Haram, which was a thing before he came in, he then started having this incredible resurgence of these quote unquote Fulani herdsmen, right? The armed Fulani pastoralists who were embarking on this genocidal spree of violence across the Middle Belt. And his government was just completely ignoring it. We're just acting as if it wasn't happening. Right? And which is partly what led me into when I got into the journalism space full time in 2018 from 2019, and then I started work with Dr. Richard and Dr. Ayo on what later became the Silent Slaughter Report, when we traveled around Nigeria documenting these experiences and these stories, and death certificates and birth certificates and pictures, and and we submitted this report to the U.S. State Department and to the U.S. Vice President, and that later resulted in Nigeria getting placed on a special diplomatic notice list. So these were the things that I could see clearly that Buhari, as that 2020 had already been like really bad news. But of course, at the points when I was leaving, I didn't realize just how bad it was going to be, even more so than what had already come.
Okay. Now, that's interesting narrative from you there. Obviously, the Buhari, I would say that the Buhari, like Nigeria, had happened to you, as it has happened to many that have lost a lot. And one of the spaces there, I think at some point I switched off because I felt like, Jesus, so people really went through these horrendous things, you know. Now let's come back to as what many has tagged the bombshell that you dropped this morning. Before we get into the meat of the matter, I would ask you, what informed, I would say, how and why did you start digging this particular piece that you dropped today?
Well, I mean, this for months. I had like months ago. I had already made a decision that I wanted to do a story about this guy specifically because I consider him to be one of the primary architects in the disaster that was visited on Nigeria in 2015 and onward. I feel as if he is so far like history has not properly documented his role in the sheer amount of destruction that has taken place over the past 7 years. I think he's recognized more as just, oh, he's the guy who he just funded Buhari's campaign. He was just the this money man from Lagos who spent money on Buhari's campaign, gave Buhari his private jet or whatnot. So even Buhari's people went around saying things like, oh, it wasn't because of him that we won. We have our numbers in the north and blah 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 blah. But so I feel as if the amount of contribution that this guy had to what happened has not been acknowledged so far, and I felt like I needed to tell the story. I'm someone who believes very much in the power of stories. I believe that when when something momentous, something important happens, and you don't tell the story of that thing, then you are essentially uh,
Yeah,
taking
contribute.
away the rights of future generations to know that this thing happened, right? I consider it to be a travesty when an important story isn't told. And that's a very bad habit we have in Nigeria. We have so much history, modern history in Nigeria that has just completely died. Some history is not up to 20 years old and it doesn't exist anywhere because it was never documented. That's a problem we have in this part of the world. It's like a cultural issue we've had for hundreds of years and nothing has changed. So I said, this particular guy that I've identified as the key player in 2015, even more so than General Buhari, this guy's story needs to be told. The world needs to know that not only was he just like a money man who financed an election campaign, he was also an influence peddler whose influence stretches as far afield as Washington D.C. and it's real, actual influence. It's not implied influence; it's real influence. So when you get to know, for example, that one of his closest relationships is with Gilbert Chagri, the Lebanese billionaire, who has a very close, very, very, very close personal and professional relationship with Bill and Hillary Clinton. And as a result of that relationship, essentially you have this guy having what, to all intents and purposes, amounts to a direct line to somebody who was the U.S. Secretary of State. So when you realize, for example, that there was an entire period between like 2013 and like 2012 and 2014 when uh, the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. State Department had made several recommendations to the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to proscribe Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization. And what that would have done is that it would have criminalized any attempt to fund Boko Haram using U.S. dollars or using any kind of you know um, entity or instrument which fell under U.S. jurisdiction, which is why proscription by the U.S. government is such a very effective tool. Hillary Clinton ignored, which is a very rare thing to do
So,
for a
I'm
Secretary
sorry.
of State.
Are you linking that the reluctance to basically proscribe Boko Haram at that point, because that was
Yeah,
during Jonathan? Are you linking that directly to Bola Tinubu's
that
relationship?
is absolutely what I'm doing. And by the way, I'm not the only one who has made this link. If you actually read the story, there was a letter written by two U.S. senators, and they were the ones who actually they were the ones who raised this question to begin with. That why was this decision taken at this point in time to ignore advice from the intelligence services and from the State Department itself and not prescribe this thing, which was very clearly a deadly terrorist entity, as a deadly terrorist entity? Why did you make that decision? And
Mhm.
when you look at the relationship, the closeness of the relationship that exists between Hillary Clinton and Gilbert Chagri, it doesn't take a genius to work out that here you have a Tinubu acolyte. Tinubu was trying to win an election, and he essentially has um, influence over the U.S. Secretary of State, who has the power to prescribe or not prescribe this thing. If she prescribes this thing, it makes it weaker, which reduces his chances of winning the election. If she does the opposite, his chances of winning the election go up. What do you think he's going to do? It's clear what he's going to do. He's a selfish person. He's a Machiavellian. He's a Malthusian. That's just how he is, right? So the fact that innocent people are going to die or whatever, that's not Bola Tinubu's problem. His problem is that he wants to win an election, and he won this election. It worked brilliantly. It worked, right? And this is not just some random accusations that I'm throwing out. As I said, if you go to the article and read the letter, which I screenshotted in there's also a link to the actual. I forget the senator's name, but his website where the letter was initially published. You will see all these thoughts expressed in far greater detail than anything that I've expressed. So this isn't something that I personally came up with. It's something which is very well known in intelligence circles and in diplomatic circles. That's how influence peddling works. So this was somebody that I thought the world needs to hear this guy's story. Like in
Hmm.
addition to having this sort of very dirty past, which, by the way, is not unique to him. There are lots of public figures in Nigeria who have backgrounds where things like drug smuggling or drug trafficking, money laundering were heavily implied, if not openly evident. I've done a story before about a fellow called, I think his name is Kunle Fisher, was it? Yeah, the fellow who owns the company that prints Nigerian passports, basically, or the company that has the
Mhm.
rights to print Nigerian passports. Olayinka Fisher, yeah, that's his name, man. Basically, this guy used to be a diplomat, and he was fired from the diplomatic service for using his diplomatic pouch to transport cocaine. He He was a cross-border drug trafficker when he was in the Nigerian Diplomatic Services. I've done a story about that before. So that this isn't something that is unique to Tinubu, but what I thought was unique to him in this case was that, he is not just somebody who has a bad past and he made his money and went to just sit down somewhere and eat his money quietly, which is what most people do. Instead, this guy wants to be president, right? This guy is the same kind of thought process that Pablo Escobar had, where he thought that his drug money or his dirty money was enough to get him anything he wanted, up to and including the presidency. This guy was trying to do the same thing, and I thought, wow, apart from the fact that, from the public interest journalism side of things, you think that this is a story that is in public interest, people need to know. Just from the point of view of a storyteller, of somebody who appreciates a good story, that just struck me as a wonderful story. Like, what's a what's a negatively interesting individual? Like, what a twisted mind. Like I would love to just sort of deconstruct his personality and tell the story of this
now
man.
now you've cleared what sparked your interest. Let's now dig into the meat of the whole thing. Let's take take a step backwards and start from when he was in Chicago. Now, if reading that story, one would begin to understand, for the benefit of those who haven't read that story. And again, I would encourage every one of you to Google that story, and we will share that in the comment section. That is the West Africa Weekly. The West Africa Weekly is, I believe you own the West African Weekly, right?
Yes.
Okay. So again, he is the publisher of the West African Weekly. So in reading that story, if you take a step back, for the benefit of those listening to us, watching us now, that haven't really read that story, can you take us through the journey of how, he came from an accountant? How did he at some point get entangled to drug? And eventually, there is this raging argument that the $460,000 as of the year 1993 that he forfeited, that obviously some are now saying that, oh, that couldn't be right. But again, many will say this is US document. So it's not you, David, manufacturing this. This is a document that exists. Anyone with common sense can go and research. Now, David, would you mind taking us through that journey?
Yeah, so basically, first of all, anyone who hasn't read the story, I would advise them to read it because it contains these things in with much better lucidity than I can, put across in a live interview session. So please do read the story. My thoughts are much better expressed in writing than in speech. Now, essentially, you have this guy who's the first 2 decades of this guy's life are like essentially a complete mystery. Or it could be the first 2 decades, it could be the first 3 decades, because we literally don't know. There's just a whole segment of his life that is just completely dark. There's no records of it. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody even knows what his real name is. What is his real age? Even he probably doesn't know, because he wasn't born in Lagos. So you know how it is with people who are born in places like Iragbeji in Osun State, where he comes from. So it's entirely possible that even he doesn't know what his real age is. Now, what we do know is that from the moment when his surrogate mom, she was a lady called Alaja Habibat Mortgage. She was a member of the popular Tinubu family in Lagos. Now, when she took him in as a surrogate mom, and then he assumed an identity as a Tinubu, even though he wasn't actually born as one, she was able to send him to the US. Right, she made it possible for him to travel to the US, and he has said so. Interesting, if you know him personally, as I did once upon a time, one thing he would always tell you is after God, the next person that he has the most reverence for in life is his mom. He would always tell anyone who gets to listen. And when he said his mom, he wasn't referring to his biological mom. He was referring to his surrogate mom, Habibat Mogaji. He thought the world of her. apparently.
Sorry,
Now,
before you continue. Sorry, before you continue, you said haven't met him. So have you met Bola Ahmed Tinubu before?
oh, he and my dad were colleagues.
Okay.
Yeah, they were colleagues. So my dad was in the was a senior civil servant, and he wasn't in the civil service, but he was in political space. So he was in and around your Mudashirus and your Raji Rasakis. So we're always moving in the same circles. And he was quite familiar with my dad. In fact, when he became governor, he invited my dad on three different occasions to come and work for him, which thankfully the man turned down uh, because he said he didn't want to come back to the civil service. He had retired by that time. So yeah, this was. I mean, I probably only met him physically like once, but my dad met him several times, and he would always say like he'd always like have these little anecdotes about him. So going back to what I was saying now, in the mid 1970s when he made his way to the US, he um, spent 4 years getting 2 years getting an associate's degree, then another 2 years getting a bachelor's degree. By all accounts, he did very well in school. By all accounts, he was quite a bright student. So from there, he got recruited and he found his way into Deloitte, which is the accounting consultancy firm. Now, from there, the story starts to develop a K-leg, as we say. Now, his own version of the story is that by virtue of just being such a great employee at Deloitte, that he became a millionaire, right, in US dollars. That from bonus and salary payments, he was able to build up about $1.8 million in his bank account, which, I mean, to anyone who has even the faintest understanding of how consulting works, you would know that's absolute nonsense. Consulting does not pay that kind of money to anyone. If even if you're a partner, which is the highest level is theoretically possible to achieve, the number of partners who make that kind of money globally in any Deloitte uh, around the world, you can probably count on two hands, right? And he wasn't even a partner. He was somebody who was about 5 years into his career when he says that he had $1.8 million in his account. So you'd have to explain how a junior accountant 5 years into their career has been able to build up a position of $1.8 million. Where did that money come from? He doesn't. He claims that it came from a bonus payment and from saving his salary, which, I mean, you don't need me to tell you that there's a huge smoking gun there. There's a big red flag there. And then he left Deloitte and he ended up moving to Mobile Oil. Now at Mobile Oil, the court documents from the I think it's the Eastern District of Illinois, if I remember correctly. The court documents state that he declared his income as $2,400 a month. Right, that's what he declared his income at. Now, between 1990 and 1991, he deposited a total of about $1.8 million into his account. Bear in mind that
How
this
does
is
how does that happen if you're declaring $2,400?
exactly,
In
exactly,
in a year is less than 50, even forty
exactly.
thousand
And
dollars. So
this declaration was actually made when he filled out a loan application. He declared that that was his salary and that he had no other source of income. So essentially, he has $2,400 a month coming in, and that's that. Somehow, within the space of about 24 months, was able to pay in a total of about $1.8 million into two of his bank accounts, which clearly indicates that he did have another source of income, which was undeclared. So what was that? Now, the and by the way, these files, the PDF file, whatever, is embedded in the article. So basically, just click on it. There's a link to my Scribed page where everything is uploaded. You can download it. You can do whatever you want to do with it. It's free for public consumption. It's public interest work. So the funny enough, there was a sort of cross-agency cooperation involved in this thing. So it started as a DEA investigation into drug trafficking in the city of Gary, Indiana. DEA is what we would refer to as NDLEA in Nigeria. So they are the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US. Now, They identified a fellow called Lee Andrew Edwards as the heroin and cocaine trafficking kingpin in, in Gary, Indiana. And they identified his source, that's the person who sold heroin to him, as a Nigerian drug dealer called Abiodun Agbele, right? So they basically set up a sting operation where they got Abiodun to sell heroin to an undercover agent, and then they busted him. So basically, in return for like a lighter sentence or whatever, he agreed to cooperate. So he told them everything he knew, basically. So that was how they were able to get hold of Lee Edwards when he was later arrested. And then they discovered that Abiodun Agbele was not the mastermind behind the operation. The mastermind was a fellow called Adegboyega Muiz Akonde, who was apparently Agbele's uncle. Now, by that time, this fellow was back in Nigeria, but Agbele was handling the heroin trafficking business in Chicago on his behalf, right? And then wiring the profits back to him in Nigeria. It's at this point that the IRS got involved in the investigation. So how these investigations typically happen in the US is that where there's a federal investigation, you can have the FBI, the DEA, IRS, several federal agencies collaborating on a single case. So the IRS got involved here because there was a case of money laundering, right? So that's like a financial crime, which is where the IRS has jurisdiction. So they got involved. Now they were able to determine that uh, a fellow called Bola Tinubu was essentially receiving these large amounts of money from Agbeli, right? And that not only was he receiving large amounts of money from this guy, that he also had a pre-existing relationship with Adegboyega Muiz Akonde. Uh, they had they had a couple of businesses where they both appeared as directors on the registration documents of the businesses. One of the businesses was called Compass Financial. Um, Tinubu's wife, a lady called Oluremi Tinubu, I'm sure you know her very well. She was a senator recently in Nigeria. Oluremi Tinubu and Adegboyega Akonde's wife also had a joint bank account. So clearly, these two families were very close, right? And the IRS special agent investigating, Special Agent Kevin Moss, was able to uh, determine that essentially Bola Ahmed Tinubu was a bagman, right? Bagman is essentially a money launderer. It's what in Nigerian street parlance is what you would refer to as a loader, right? Or like a combination of loader and as a man in Nigerian street terms. So that's what this guy was, right? He was their loader stroke as a man, right? He was their bagman. He was the one handling their money laundering because one of the major headaches of being a drug dealer is that you have $1 million empire which is made out of $1 bills, right? Because it's street business. So you need a way to sort of
Clean the
make
money.
that money less sort of logistically difficult to handle. And you need a way to put that money into the banking system without triggering AML or CFT or KYC concerns from the bank, which is where you need your loader and your as a man. So that's what this guy was to them. So obviously he was an accountant, so he knew how to work the system. He knew the tricks of the trade. However, the government is the government, so no matter how many tricks of the trade you know, they will still catch you. And he got caught, right? So that's where this indictment came from. So if you read through, there's a 49-page document, PDF document, which is embedded. I'd advise everyone to please download it. It's free, it's in the open. Tinubu is a public official, so you have every right to be looking at this information. He's not a private citizen anymore. It's in the public domain, right? It's a public document. So please download it and feel free to look through it to your heart's desire. Now, when so the I think the investigating special agent Kevin Moss reached out to Tinubu in January '92. By this time, Tinubu was in Nigeria, so he reached out to him. Tinubu reached out to him via a telephone call when he discovered that his accounts had been frozen because basically the feds had obtained a court order freezing some of his accounts with about 1.4 something million. So Kevin Moss then, if you read through the story, because again, I get very sort of I don't like sort of reading through, summarizing my entire story again. It's very exhausting, right?
Mm.
It just writing it was exhausting enough. Having to just run through it is just anyway. Long story short, uh, at first he admits that yes, he's friends with Agbele and Akonde and they are business partners or whatever, and that a lot of the money coming into his accounts belongs to them. He admits that at first, and then a few days later does a complete about face and says no, he doesn't know them. They don't have any business together. Blah 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 blah. And that's that. So essentially, you have a situation where the feds on one side versus Tinubu on the other side. So and the feds have already obtained a court order to freeze all these accounts, and they are hoping to have all this money forfeited to the U.S. government. Now, obviously, Tinubu being an accountant and being a smart guy, is still able to work the system a bit. So he doesn't just let it go without a fight. So he does he engages like back and forth, expensive litigation basically. And essentially the decision is made by the feds that okay, you know what, here's what we'll do. We are going to forfeit some of this money because this money is the proceeds of drug trafficking, right? These are the proceeds of heroin sales. So we are going to forfeit $460,000 of this money, right? That we can absolutely and without question prove came from heroin trafficking. The other $1 million, which probably and most likely came from heroin trafficking, but whose case is not as strong as the 460,000, we're going to release that to you, right? And we're going to end the case here. Now, that to many people who see that part of the story, like they're always confused that why would the U.S. government do that? But the thing is, that's how the U.S. government settles a lot of cases. And I
But
included the reason why.
isn't that plea bargain in this case?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. I included the reason why in the story that the U.S. Justice Department actually has a guideline where it states very openly that asset forfeiture settlements are encouraged to save the resources of the U.S. government. So essentially, when you have a situation where the amount of litigation and arbitration that is involved, the, the the amount of legal expense that is involved in fighting this case versus the amount of money that they're trying to seize, and it's not making sense anymore. They'll be like, you know what, it doesn't make sense to spend $10 so that we can seize $9. So instead, let's do a settlement, right? So we'll take four and we'll leave five for you and call that justice, right? Call it a win because it's better to have some of nothing than all of nothing, right? So that's how it works. Now, for those who aren't in the know, for those who don't understand that this is a fact of how the U.S. government works, and plea bargaining is one of the biggest fixtures of the U.S. justice system. The the FBI has a conviction rate of about 95% for everybody that it indicts. And the reason it has that conviction rate is that almost nobody bothers to go to trial because once the feds have a case on you, you did that. Whatever they accuse you of, you did it, right? The possibility of you going to trial and getting acquitted is 5% because they are very good at their job. And again, I'd recommend that people actually read through that indictment documents because it is thorough, right? If you read through the documents and read what Special Agent Kevin Moss says in his own words, right, and the sheer amount of research and documentation and bear in mind that this is the U.S. government that has access to everything. So then you would understand that this is not about Bola Tinubu, neither is it about David Hundeyin. This is a U.S. government investigation that was carried out by people who didn't care about Bola Tinubu or David Hundeyin, right? That it just is what it is. So please read through that document. Long story short, this guy he wins his election in 1992 because he stood for the senatorial election in 92 under the SDP, and he was the candidate for Lagos West, and he won. A year later, the botched June 12 election took place, and one way or the other, this guy found himself, converted overnight into a hero of democracy. A Nadeko person fighting for democracy, quote unquote, even though like he was never really that person. But that's sort of what fate thrust on him. And I think maybe he spotted an opportunity to play up to that hero image in there. So over the next 5 years, he was in the UK at the time. His family was in the US, or so he says anyway. And he was heavily involved in Nadeco activities. He was a very big funder of Nadeco activities. Nobody really understood how or where he got the money from, but I was able to uncover that in this story as well. That all the while that everyone thought that this guy was some bedraggled guy hiding out in London. There's this picture of him in London with Dele Momodu from the
Yeah.
90s,
Yeah.
where he like he's a tramp and whatnot. Meanwhile, this guy had millions of dollars sitting in the bank, and I was able to prove it through his real estate transactions. Because during that decade, where he was supposedly at his lowest ebb and whatnot, this guy spent close to $1 million on buying real estate in the US, right? Buying houses, no fewer than 3 houses between 1993 and 1998. Right. So this guy had money, like money. Right? So again, and that's just one very small detail. There are so many of these little details which is why I said please read the story, because even after writing it, it's not everything I put down that I can recall off the top of my
And
head. I don't
you
memorize my
you
own.
you even went as far as showing some of the houses in question.
Oh yeah, oh
Yeah,
yeah. Because
you
again,
give
in
us.
in the in the US, this information is available on public record, right? So using services like Zillow and Redfin, you can get all of this information like at the tap of a button, at click of a mouse, right? It's not like Nigeria where a lot of these things you have to pull out your head to find it. It's just right there, right?
And you can look
So
at this, this particular one here. You can see the deed. I wasn't aware that the deeds can be uploaded online because this is
oh
MD2.
yeah, oh yeah. I mean, you have to pay to access the database for most counties in the US. They will
Okay.
charge you a nominal fee, maybe $15 or $10. You will pay, but it's not a lot of money. But and once you pay and you get it, everything is there. It's subject to, well, it's not subject to the freedom of information,
So,
but many counties in the US make it sort of open in a way. So if you want to pay, you can access it. It's right there in the open. It's not like Nigeria where you have to go to the land registry and do manual search, and there's all manner of hoops you have to jump through. There, like they value access to
yeah,
information, which is what makes my job really, really
ex- you know,
enjoyable sometimes
you
as
know,
compared to when I'm
look at
doing it in Nigeria.
David. Looking at this, as you rightly said. So this was when the Nedeco fight was ongoing. So from all indication, this property was bought in 1995. That was during the time of Abacha.
Yes.
So apparently, do you have an idea how the source of this was made? Was it that time through that, forfeited his own share of those monies that were forfeited?
I mean, he's the only one that can answer that question.
Mm.
He's the only one that can answer that question, because the the amount of money he spent on real estate exceeded the amount of money okay, that's not true. It didn't exceed the amount of money that was released to him, but
Mm.
it was almost equivalent to the amount of money that was released to him. So you would have to assume that there was actually even some more money salted away in God knows where, because in the document he also mentioned that he had bank accounts in London, which obviously weren't part of the scope of this story. So how much did he have in London? We don't even know.
Mm.
So like these are the issues. You
Mm.
understand? Like how much money was this guy holding? Because uh, unlike now, where everything is on an electronic system at the touch of a button, any bank account you have anywhere in the world can be identified. There's an electronic. Back then, if you read the story, there was a there was a bit where the FBI the IRS agent asked him that does he have any other bank accounts, and he said no, he doesn't have. And then a few days later, Citibank did their own search and discovered that he had two other bank accounts, but they weren't in his name. They were in the name of the business Compass Financial, which he owned. Right? You couldn't get away with something like that now. Now they wouldn't even need to ask you. They will just search and find everything. But back
Oh,
then, everything was
they might
right.
ask you, but they are looking at you, looking at the computer. You're sitting across.
Exactly,
They're looking at
exactly.
all
But
your
back then, it
details.
was easier to hide stuff. So
Yeah.
how much money was he hiding? We don't know. Only he probably knows.
Okay. Now let's quickly, in reading through this story, at some point, suddenly, the much revered MKO Abiola appeared in your writing. And for the inquiry, for people who are curious, what link did MKO Abiola? Because part of the things you said in your writing, or rather, part of the things you included in there, is that that link was one of the things that made the military to actually not wanting to hand over to Abiola. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, so I've heard rumors about this for a long time. There was an article that was done, I think, in 2017 by the Daily Beast, where Tinubu's connections to heroin trafficking were hinted at. But that was it; they were just hinted at, and like I felt as if the article didn't. The article was it teased a lot and delivered almost nothing. It was a lot of hearsay that was in the article, like so and so
Mm.
person said, or so and so person allegedly, so and so person reportedly. There was a lot of the word reportedly in that article. Like I felt like no, I need something stronger. So I looked for the. I looked at. I went to search for the people who were mentioned in that article. So. What's his name? A fellow called Andrew Callum, who used to work in the U.S. diplomatic services and who once had a position at the U.S. embassy in Nigeria. Then former U.S. ambassador, what's his name? Is it David Campbell? Something Campbell. I can't believe I've
David
forgotten
Campbell.
his first. Yeah, him. And then a fellow called Prof. Gary Bush, who had also been very vocal about his views on MK Abiola. And I was basically just waiting to see which one of them would get back to me. And Prof. Bush got back to me with quite a lengthy statement. In fact, what I included in the article was like a clipping from the statement he sent. The full statement was about like 6 paragraphs long, right?
Mm.
And he mentioned stuff about Tinubu as well. But I just thought, you know what, like I'm already doing a story about Tinubu. There's no need to.
Mm.
So what I was trying to establish with his comment was, look, was MKO like even like notionally linked to this thing, or was there a perception at the time that MK was linked to drug trafficking? Like who do you know of that had such thoughts? And he basically, in a statement, he basically said that look, it was well known that even within like the Nigerian military itself, a lot of the opposition to MKO's candidacy was born out of the fact that this guy was known in local and international circles to be linked to drug trafficking. And then people like Boruji Kashamu
Kashamu.
also mentioned, and, which I found very interesting. And that look, the U.S. Authorities or the U.S. ambassador, obviously they couldn't directly interfere in Nigeria's internal politics, but clearly they were less than happy with MKO's candidacy. But Ibrahim Babangida sort of, because he was good friends with MKO, as I'm sure you're aware, he sort of sat on his hands and didn't do anything, and he did that. He was trying to like play both sides of the field in like typical Maradona fashion that you know Babangida for. So tell MKO that everything is fine, you're going to be the next president, and then tell the military and the diplomatic corps and the U.S. ambassador, whatever, that don't worry, I'm handling the situation. And he wasn't handling anything. He was basically just sat in the middle, sitting on his hands, basically doing nothing. Until MKO, it became clear that MKO was about to win the election, and then there's going to be a problem, and then he annulled the election. And that was essentially Gary Prof. Bush's explanation of why June 12 was annulled. Now, obviously, that's his explanation of why June 12 was annulled. Babangida himself has never come out to clear the air. Every time he speaks on the subject, he speaks a lot of English for 20 minutes and ends up saying absolutely nothing. Right? He's
You
very
know,
good at doing that.
while reading that, I thought to myself, I mean, I wish they could actually clear some of these things before they join
Well,
the ancestors.
yeah. So I included that because I thought uh, this is a very interesting. Apart from the fact that it's subjectively important information, it's a very interesting storytelling device because here you have this guy almost exactly 30 years later following the exact same route that MKO took. Suppose also having links to the international drug trade, also you playing this sort of like Yoruba ethnic politics card, trying to position himself as a successor or replacement for Awolowo. Also chose a Muslim ticket, that a Muslim
Yeah,
VP
a
to run on
Muslim
a
Muslim.
Muslim.
A lot is actually coming together there.
Yeah,
Exactly
so if you notice,
30 years.
even the cover art that I had my editor, my
Yes,
designer do for me. If you notice, there was an element of that
of
sort of,
MKO at the background.
yeah, exactly. So he was used as a watermark in the background with Tinubu's face in the foreground, which I thought was a brilliant way of communicating that. So, and it was basically like, look, here you have it, right? So, is this guy going to end up the same way MKO ended up, or is he going to be lucky the way he's always lucky? Lucky in the sense that his two unemployed daughters with no known source of income were able to pay over $2 million cash each for deluxe condos in New York. That kind of lucky. Nobody knows where they got the money from. Or lucky in the sense that every time there's an election where his candidate or his anointed candidate has a very good chance of losing, something happens to the other guy, such as in 2007 when the other guy just showed up dead, having been strangled to death in his home, one of the safest places in Lagos. Or lucky in the sense that when he was taken to court by a co-founder of Alpha Beta to basically examine his role in money laundering in Alpha Beta, and bear in mind that the court documents for the Alpha Beta lawsuits were also embedded in the story. So please click on all the links. And that look,
Mm.
when that happened, the what's it called, the Igboshere High Court in Lagos burned to ashes, burned to the ground. Case files were destroyed. Until now, the case has not been refiled.
What a
Right. So
coincidence.
that kind of luck. Exactly what it looked like. What a wonderful coincidence. And lucky in the sense that when he needed to win his election in 2015, and to win that election, he needed Boko Haram to become, to maintain a level of support. Then, coincidentally, the U.S. Secretary of State, who was very close to his good friend Gilbert Shagiri, refused to designate Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization, which allowed it to remain powerful, and he won his election. Lucky guy. Very, just a bunch of very fortunate coincidences because like he was born under a four-leaf clover or something. So yeah, that's basically the story.
Now, if in all these court documents, I am, surprisingly, there is nowhere that I saw where they have like DOBs, the date of birth. Now, but there is something that is, he submitted his credentials to INEC, and suddenly the whole nation went agog that he doesn't have a primary and secondary school. But you affirmed here that that he studied accounting and he was a brilliant chap. Now, does that, by what you've just said and by the things you found out while you were researching this report, does that then put to rest this conversation about certificate or no certificate? If
No,
he
no,
if he really went to school,
no, it doesn't because so if when he first got to the US, the first educational institution he went to was I believe it's called Richard J. Daley College, which is a community college in Chicago, where he obtained an associate's degree. Now, an associate's degree is essentially like is what in Nigeria is what we call an OND, right? And to get into a community college in the US, all you need to do is pass this exam called the GED, which is essentially like SSC, like it's a high school diploma, right?
Exactly. So
Just-
do you
it's just an exam you need to sit,
mm,
right? There's no school you need to attend. You just need to sit
mhm.
the exam and pass it. So it's entirely possible you could have been homeschooled. It's entirely possible you could have been self-taught, or you could have gone to a particular school. Who knows? Again, his backstory is just shrouded in mystery. The only part of the story that we can trace it from is from his entry into Richard Daley College onward. Anything that happened before then, anything that happened before he landed in Chicago, is anybody's guess. The only thing we know for certain before he landed in Chicago was that his surrogate mom, Habibat, uh, Alaja Habibat Mogaji, was a very large part of the reason why he was able to move to the US. She was able to put together some money for him, and she basically changed his life. And if you'd met him, he never shut up about her basically. That she's the reason why he's where he is today, and blah blah blah. So I think that's the only part about his pre-American life that you can hold on to for a fact and say that this happened. Anything beyond that, I have no idea, and I don't think anybody does, even him.
Mm. No, but that's then like I said before, that in my view should put that conversation to rest, because if you've just said now that he attended this community school and obviously had something or came out with what could be as ascribed to OND, what went gone ahead to study or rather eventually Chicago State University or University of Chicago, whichever one, and here he is now, and the Nigerian electoral law says GCSE or its equivalent. So equivalent, if you have OND, it's higher than, because in the
Oh
case
yeah,
of Buhari,
he's qualified. He's qualified. I don't think that was
mm,
the issue. It's not like a Buhari situation where there was a question mark about whether the person had the academic qualifications. I don't think that was ever an issue here. I think the issue was that in 1999, the academic institutions that he put on his INEC form were not academic institutions that he went to. He basically lied and then blamed it on on Tokumbo Afikuyomi. So I think that's the issue here. The fact that he said he went to a place that he categorically did not go to, and
mm.
that he kept that lie up for many years on up until 2022. Then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, actually, I didn't actually go to so and so school." You know, so
Now
he told a
in
lie in '99. He's reversing
mm,
himself now. So I think that's what the scandal is about.
it might even be if we had I think it was called Nedeco that time in 1990. When I believe 1992, before the elections of 1993. If one could also lay hands on those documents that he filled at that point, obviously it might be another lie, or it might be that that's something that he repeated when he then eventually became a governor. We never know. Now, looking at that, there are many under the your tweet saying that he cannot go to the US, but it is on record that he went to the US, I believe, in 2012, correct?
So to be honest, I don't know anything about him not being able to go to the US. I feel as if a lot of commentators on social media say things that they heard a popular person say and they just repeat it. So the fact that a lot of people are saying something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So I try as much as possible not to like tune out the noise. So I stick to what I can prove. I stick to the provable. And what can be
Mm,
proven without a shadow of doubt is that he laundered money for a heroin trafficking ring in Chicago in the 1990s, and that he received a federal indictment for it, and he forfeited close to $500,000 at least for that. That's provable, and to be honest, that's enough. So anything beyond that, oh, he's not been allowed to visit the area. I don't think that's true in the first place because the terms of the settlement made it very clear that the once he agrees to these terms, the case has been settled with prejudice. It was stated there. Settled with prejudice means that the case cannot be reinstated in court again. It means that it's done with. It's been just like it's over. Right? It can't be
Settled with
brought
prejudice or
back to
settled
court
without
for
prejudice?
consideration again. That's what they said with prejudice. No, I actually searched the what's it called, a legal database for this.
Mm,
So without prejudice means the opposite. Without prejudice means, I'm letting this thing go, but at any time as I may choose to, without prejudice, I can bring it back. With prejudice means the opposite. It means that it's done. It's
mm,
permanently discharged. So if that case was settled with prejudice, I don't think there's anything there legally speaking stopping him from returning to the US. So I don't think that particular bit was true. I don't know who said. And one thing is that a lot of these narratives are started by these people themselves. So, for example, he knows that he's free to visit the US. He will now start a narrative that he's not free to visit the US, that is something. So that the day he now goes to the US, he will take a picture there, and then it's like constructing a big straw man, right? Nigerian politicians do that thing a lot. So again,
mm,
I try as much as possible to stay clear of the noise, right? Just because a lot of
mm.
people are repeating something doesn't mean that there's any truth to it, because they might have just heard it from one place, and they just because that like Nigerians are very good at doing that. They hear something here in some online beer parlor somewhere and just start to repeat it. So I remember in 2018 or 2017 when everybody started talking about some fellow called Jubril Al Sudaini. I'm talking about him like he was a fact that existed. That no, Muhammad
Mm.
Buhari is dead and he's been replaced by a guy called Jubril Al Sudaini. And where did that idea? Like so many people were saying it at the same time, and where did it come from? Apparently, it came from a radio broadcast by one person called Nnamdi Kanu, who could have pulled that entire thing out of his ass. So when Nigerians are saying something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know what they're talking about. So again, I just tend to stick to the provable.
Now, in one, there is an insertion you made in your in the article here, and what it is very simple here. The argument, or rather, let me rephrase this. Do you think it's a paid job that suddenly Nigerians woke up and they start reading stories like Nigeria, U.S. clears Governor Tinubu of criminal deals? Was that something that was real, or was that something that was just implanted there to help clean up what was behind the curtain?
So it's very instructive that when you read stories like that, so people again, it goes back to what I was just saying about somebody creating a straw man for him to knock down. There's a real issue. So to take attention away from that issue, or to sort of undermine that issue or make it look stupid, you then take something that is not too far from that issue, but is not that issue, and then you blow it up, knowing full well that there's nothing there. So you know that you have an indictment for money laundering on behalf of drug traffickers. So instead of doing a fact check to say, does this person have a federal indictment for money laundering, you instead say, was this person convicted, or does this person have any conviction? And obviously, the reply that comes back is no, this person has no convictions, because obviously that's what the system
I
sees.
was not convicted.
Are there convictions? Are there no convictions? That's it. Now, the ignorant person reading that story will see no convictions. I think that means that you've been given a clean bill
Mm,
of health.
mm,
And not the tips and tricks of the game.
mm. Int- Interesting. Interesting how you know, how you expose these things.
Right?
Um,
Like if you do commercial PR, this is like something like right. So like from journalism to PR, you don't have to just instantly tell that this is the because like come on, this was my job, right? I understand what people are doing when they do things like that. Issa Pantami did something like that last year when it emerged. It was very embarrassing for him. It emerged that he was actually when he was the chief imam at Abubakar Tafawa Balewa University Mosque, and he was actually sacked. He was thrown out of the mosque because, as a direct result of his extremist sort of teachings, people died. Like this guy sparked a riot, and at least one person died, and then he got thrown out, and. when he managed to keep it hush, because back then obviously there was no internet. So if something happened in Bauchi, it stayed in Bauchi. Somebody in Lagos will not know. But by 2021, obviously the world was a different place. So then people started to share the news and whatnot when his whole story started coming out. And then a journal, so he now, when he was hosting a press conference, he now organized a journalist to ask him a question that sounded like that question, but which was a completely different question. So instead of asking him, were you thrown out of your job as chief imam at ATBU? Which is obviously yes or no answer. And if you say no, there are obviously records, there's documentation showing that you were. So instead of doing that, the journalist now asked him, um, because he was also a student before he became chief imam. He graduated
Mm.
from there before he moved. So the journalist now asked him were you ever rusticated for Islamic extremism? Like, were you thrown out when you were a student?
No.
And he said, no, I was never thrown out as a student, and you can go and verify this, and blah, 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 blah. And he's telling the truth. Obviously, he wasn't thrown out as a student. But that's not the answer. That's not the question. You understand? Somebody is
Mhm.
intentionally asking a misleading question so that you arrive at the wrong answer. That's how these PR strategies work. So when they say, oh, the Tinubu doesn't have a conviction in the US, well, yeah, Al Pacino also never had a murder conviction. You know,
Mhm.
they got Al Pacino on tax evasion. So that's like Al Pacino coming out and saying that he never killed anyone, or someone now defending Al Pacino that he never killed anyone. He never had a murder conviction. Like, are you serious?
Mm. Now, before we conclude this evening, David, let's come back to the current political landscape. Obviously, we have Atiku, Peter Obi, and Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Looking at these three candidates, would you consider, because every day you wake up, we hear people talking about obedient and datified, and some say useful. Would you consider the aborted NSAS that this movement or the current Obi movement is an extension of that aborted NSAS? Or as some people will call it, a democratic NSAS. What's your view on that?
I don't agree that it's an extension, primarily because a lot of the players and the people involved are not the same people. However, I do agree that the energy is almost identical to that of NSAS. And I also agree that NSAS possibly served as a template. The NSAS probably served as the like in my experience anyway, the first time ever really in Nigeria that I remember in my 32 years where young people like, well, let me speak for the South and the Middle Belt. I don't really know about the North because obviously like their experience with NSAS was a bit different. But across the entire South and Middle Belt, across that, for example, that Yoruba and Igbo, that intractable, like irritating divide, and for the first time, everybody forgot about that. And everybody had a single goal. Like I recall that I think this was in October 2020. I think this was like October 8 or 9. When like I remember I woke up one morning and I was scrolling through Twitter and it just hit me that I've been scrolling for like 20 minutes and I'm yet to see a single tweet that doesn't have the NSARS hashtag or isn't about NSARS. Like literally, that's the only thing that exists in public conversation right now. Nothing else exists. People couldn't release new music. Netflix couldn't put out new stuff. Everybody said, please wait first. We have this thing. Like I'd never seen that kind of thing before. And I think that sort of um, facilitated the development of this new kind of political engagement that we're seeing. I don't agree that it's a logical success of NSARS because to say that will be to put people in trouble. So I don't think that's what it is, right? But I think that NSARS definitely played a huge role in sort of um, inspiring young Nigerians, teaching them to engage in this sort of very, very new, very exciting, very unapologetic, very vigorous, very switched on and engaged manner that probably we've not seen witnessed we've never seen before 2020. So yeah, absolutely. So I guess the answer to your question is in a sense yes, but also no. In a
Mm,
notional sense, yes, but in a personal sense, absolutely not.
mm. In one of your recent tweets, when Peter Obi tweeted and apologized on behalf of his supporters for those Reno Omokri and some others always wake up every day and accuse them of insulting people. You reacted to that tweet and you kind of told him to stay away of his Twitter tweets. So, do you think that those quote unquote violent tweets or threats that do come from, or rather alleged, let me put it that way, alleged violent tweets, do you believe that they come from where they say they come from? Or is it an imaginary threat?
To be honest, I think like it's creating a mountain out of like something less than a molehill, right? And the reason I say that is I was around in this campaign space in 2015. I wasn't just around as an observer. I worked in marketing communication at the time. I worked in PR. So thankfully, the agency I worked at wasn't doing political work, but I was very, I was in the room when things were being discussed. I was in the room when things were happening on the back end, right? So I saw what people did. I saw how close they came to sparking an all-out ethnic war in Nigeria because they wanted to win an election, right? Many people don't know this, but on election day in 2015, the word Igbos was number one top trend. Like Igbos, and I think there was Igbo, then there was Igbos. Like keywords, basically like they're referencing people from the southeast. They were like three of the top five trends on Nigerian Twitter for like 48 hours, and they were not organic trends. I was in the room where people were using a platform called Ad Dynamo. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I think it's been discontinued now. But
Mm.
back then, it was a platform called Ad Dynamo where you could create artificial social media trends. You would pay, obviously, it was quite expensive, but you would pay and you could have something trend for as long as you wanted it to, right? And these people decided that part of their execution strategy for winning an election in 2015 was to spark and inflame ethnic tensions all through the lead up to election and including election day, specifically in Lagos. So some of the messages being pushed out with these like sock puppet dummy accounts on Twitter at the time, saying things like people in Festac and Niamey and Satellite Town shouldn't be allowed to vote. Obviously, we know that people who stay there they tend to be from the southeast. That those people are they are ungrateful, blah blah blah. How dare they? Those messages were not organic, right? Many people don't realize this. All of this was I was in the room when these things were happening. Like I'm not captain here. Like I saw this. Like I know the people who were responsible for these things, right? Once upon a time, I might have considered these people to be my colleagues and friends, right? Because we worked in the same industry. So when you witness the toxicity of 2015 up close, and then people are complaining that oh, the so-called obedience are attacking or mockery online. I'm like, please, like, let's be serious here. Like this, what is happening today is it's not it's if 2015 was a bomb, what's happening today is like it's like banger fireworks. That's like it's nothing compared to what 2015 was. It's not even on this on this like the scale of reference is completely different, right? At least all that is happening now is just people just supposedly allegedly being mean on Twitter. That's it. That's where it ends.
You
Back
know,
then, people were
I've
getting fired
actually,
from their
uh,
jobs back then.
mm,
People were putting calls through to people's bosses. Sorry, sorry, okay.
I've actually challenged three people specifically, no name mentioned here, but I mean those tweets are on Twitter Street. You know, when you read, I mean, you scroll, like you said, you read people's reaction, and you do not see people, a people going out to attack. Rather, people like sitting in their own part, just playing defense. If the ball comes your way, you just kick it back. If the ball comes your way, just kick it back. And suddenly, someone it's sitting on the bench and saying, wow, these guys at the defense that they are attacking, they are throwing every manner of weapon. And you're like, hold on, people. Unless I'm watching a different game than what you guys are watching. If this is the same game I'm watching, it's actually the other way around. That, because I don't see how people wake up and they put up some negativity, and that at some point I ask myself, all these deaths that are digging out on one candidate, or all the attacks on one candidate, when is the other camp going to even start? Or are they never going to start? Because though it's part of a political process, but it's like what you said. It appears it's taken out of context. But one thing nobody has, amongst the three people in question that I mentioned, one thing none of them has ever been able to do is to show clear evidence of those things that they allege. Like one of them said that someone followed him in the United Kingdom. I said, well, thank God it's not in Nigeria that someone was following you. If someone followed you in the United Kingdom and is about to inflict bodily harm, the United Kingdom is one of those.
To be honest, there's a 100% chance that he was telling lies anyway. So I wouldn't really.
You putting it at 100%. Maybe you can add one. It make it 101 because it's definitely fluking. Definitely. David, it's been a very great time. We can't stop. It's really, really, really good speaking to you. Now, before I let you go, let's look at the chances of Bola Tinubu, for instance. What's your view on these new trend of, or rather, this new approach of having a Muslim ticket? Some have argued that it's actually been insensitive to some Nigerians or some parts of Nigeria. Some say it doesn't matter. If it was done 30 years ago, why can't we repeat that now? And many have argued, including myself, if it means nothing, wouldn't and shouldn't we consider having something like a Christian or a Southern presidency, which is why in the First Republic, when Zik, didn't want to form government with Awolowo on the basis that it wasn't right for South and South to rule and govern the affairs of a nation that has other ethnicity and regions within the country. What's your view?
To be honest, bearing in mind what has taken place in 2015 and the fact that there's a literal report which exists and is in the public domain, which proves that a literal ethno-religious genocide, at least in the Middle Belt, has taken place over the past 6 years. And the use of the word genocide is not an exaggeration because even the US government agrees with its characterization as a genocide. Then at the very least, very least, you would have to say at least out of respect for the people who have been the victims or who identify the victims of that genocide, i.e. Christians in the Middle Belt or anywhere in Nigeria, really, at the very least, those people would need, because even with a Christian on the, as the vice president of the existing administration, they saw the hell that they saw. So at the very least, out of respect for them, at the very absolute minimum, you would think that at least maintain that status quo. But here we are, and it's like, you know what, you people are not even important. And like for me, that's the sense that I'm getting from this election, that there's a sort of very toxic arrogance that some people are trying to sort of impose on the electoral space in Nigeria, that there's an entire part of the country that we're going to just designate you as irrelevant and unnecessary, right? So Southeast, South, we're just going to act like, you don't matter, because actually you don't. Like, we can win with or without you. So whether it's your ethnic identity or because let's first of all, let's be very clear about something. what wins elections in Nigeria traditionally is ethnicity and religion. Those are the deciding factors. Everything else is noise, right? The Peter Obi phenomenon, if it's successful, will be the first time, and I make no bones about saying this, will be the first time in Nigeria's history that a leader would ever have been selected on the basis of something called competence. That's never happened before. Right? If I'm going by precedent, it's ethnicity and it's religion in that order. So already you've broken the sort of unwritten power sharing pact, right? The principle of power rotation, right? Where power was supposed to go to the southeast this time around, right? This was very well known, right? This wasn't a secret. This was not a controversial position to express. This was known that 2023 it was supposed to rotate to the southeast. So first of all, you've broken that sort of gentleman's agreement, and then to add insult to injury, you then want to make it like all Muslim. So even if you don't have any bad intentions, just from the optics point of view, it's absolutely awful. It's unforgivable from an optics point of view at the very least. So no, it's absolutely is not something that I'm on board with. To be honest, even if it was a even if it were a Christian ticket, I would say the same thing. Even though you would say I'm from the south, I was raised Christians. Obviously, I would identify with. But be that as it may, the truth is that if you are running a multi-religious and multi-ethnic society, multi-religious and multi-ethnic country, you have to respect the fact that variety exists and that you have to account for it. You have to live with it. That you can't spend your time going around trying to defeat people that you are sharing a country with, right? So,
I mean,
but
it's
then
just,
again,
you
it
know,
seems
it's just like someone, maybe some from the southeast, or maybe someone from, I mean, from south picking another, someone like from southeast, or from south picking another southerner as a
yeah,
running mate. What will
yeah.
be
It's
the
like
feeling?
Peter Obi leaving Doyin Okupe as his VP and saying, "Yeah, that will fly." Like I would have been mortified if he ever tried to do such a thing. But that's literally what Tinubu has done here.
Yeah,
Like,
but what do you think gives him, what do you think gives him that confidence that it will be repeated or that it will happen? Is there
so
any form of data that that could give insight into what drives that level of confidence?
to be honest, I think when it comes to people like Bola Tinubu, I think they're just literally drunk on power, and they have an extreme case of hubris. When you have hubris, you believe that you know everything, and you believe that you are untouchable, you believe that you are beyond reproach, you believe that you are beyond humbling, and you believe that there's nothing anybody has to tell you. You've forgotten more than most people will ever know. So, you know.
And by the way, the only reason why he wasn't vice president to Muhammad Buhari was because of the same thing. So, and some people are now saying, even as mean as you can think that President Muhammad Buhari is even more humane in considering religious diversity.
Exactly. Exactly. But when you have somebody who, I think for the past 30 or 40 years, hasn't really had somebody who can tell him no in any meaningful sense. I mean, he has had people tell him no for like minor reasons. Like my dad told him no. I'm not going to work for you. But those are minor no's. But real no's, as in this huge project you want to embark on, no. This governor you want to impose, or this candidate you want to impose on Lagos, no. Or this candidate you want to impose on Nigeria, even though you yourself know and have said repeatedly in the past that this guy is not good for a country like Nigeria, no. He hasn't had anybody to tell him no. So when you go through life long enough and people just constantly enable you every step of the way, after a while you lose the right, you lose the ability to judge between what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Because who's in front of a camera, in front of a microphone, he was very aware that the camera and microphone were there, and he threw a full-on adult tantrum. I said, Emilio, come, it's my turn. Like to be the president of 180 million people. He said it. Right? It wasn't a moment of weakness or something. It was a performance. He said it like he was throwing down a challenge. Like, yes, I am, you know, the way he refers to himself in the third person. He doesn't describe himself as Tinubu, he describes himself as Lagos. That's how he sees himself inside his head. Right? When you're having a late night meeting with him and he wants to go rest or something, you say Lagos is tired, Lagos wants to sleep. He go first soon. Yeah, that's the thing. My dad used to tell me. So that's how he sees Nigeria too. That Nigeria is his new Lagos. You understand? Like it's Emilio Khan is my thing. You understand?
Does that
That's how he sees it. Like he's
does
one
that
of the most
perform
entitled people you will ever have the displeasure of coming across. So just the thought of this guy becoming president, like as you say, Muhammadu Buhari would like would actually come across as like okay, maybe that guy wasn't so bad by the time this guy is still with us, which is why I really hope a Tinubu presidency doesn't happen. But if it does, oh well.
Well, Nigerians have a distinction in grabbing that which ought not to be. Isn't that true? You look at some states and in their governors, and you wonder where did you kind of excavate these individuals and put
Yeah, I
them there.
mean, look at the president himself. So it is what it is.
And even after the first 4 years, the same people that were complaining that this is unbearable, they went ahead and re-elected him. I never knew he was going to
Yep.
get half of the vote he got. So, is it true then that Nigerians like their oppressors?
I don't know about like, but they're definitely in a sort of like abusive mental relationship with them. I definitely don't think they see themselves as equal to them. So I think when you by default think of someone as like a superior life form to you, you sort of allow them get away with a bunch of nonsense that they shouldn't get away with, right? Because I don't understand how you've just seen a story telling you how 22 and 25-year-olds with no source of income and no job are paying 2 point something million dollars cash to buy
Well,
their own homes in
they are from a rich
one of the most
they are
expensive
from a
cities.
rich family, quote unquote.
Yeah, and you defending this guy like it's a sort of like a relationship. That's how I see it.
David, thank you very much. That's a very fine place to anchor it. It has been a pleasure to speak with you here for the last 90 minutes with myself. Indeed, reading your work, I think one of the things I've done after I
Yeah.
read this work, I copied it, I put it in an audio, text reader to read it. And I think maybe driving, I would like to have it repeated so that the whole thing sinks in. It is unbelievable. And again, the amount of time and
Right.
depth you put into all these your research. I was reading some of the things people were saying today. I hope you are aware. There were some screenshots shared on Twitter streets
I
today.
saw them, yeah. The
Yeah, where they're
WhatsApp groups
saying
and
that there is confusion in the some APC WhatsApp group. Some are threatening that they have to deal with you. Some say that they need to sue you. Some say that they need to take you away. So the only thing we can ask you is to ensure that you have multiple eyes around you. The good thing is that you are in a place where harm is very likely to get to your doorstep. But even if at that, being too careful, you can never be too careful, right? So, David, once more, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. It's been indeed an enriching conversation. And for many of you who haven't read this piece written by David, please endeavor to read. Endeavor to read. That is West Africa Weekly. David is the publisher, and David is when you hear an investigative journalist to the core. David, pleasure having you here.
Same.
I think you're frozen. Okay. I think your connection towards the end is beginning to, Nigeria is beginning to happen to your connection. On that note, I say, everyone, thank you once more for being part of this. This has been one-on-one conversation with David Hundeyin, who is the author of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, From Drug Lord to Presidential Candidate. I am Mazes, okay? If you haven't subscribed to this platform, I would say please, by all means, do. Click like, share with others, and join us next time as we will be having such explosive and exclusive conversations where we allow people to come in and give us depth to things that many of us might still be thinking they are hearsay. If David hasn't researched this, if he hasn't come now to explain what led him to doing this and the steps taken with evidence. Again, for those that are watching, if you look at the comment section, the link is being shared there. You can just click on that link and watch, or rather, and read the content of what David has put out for all of us to read, and that is pro bono. Again, I call upon you to support his work. You can subscribe to that for his newsletters, and you can also chip in the little you can to support the good work that he does. On that note, I will say to us, good evening, good night, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. And I am Mazi. It's okay. Bye for now.